What if the history you were taught was never the beginning, but the aftermath? Not the rise of civilization, but the echo left behind after something vast, organized, and powerful was erased so completely that even memory itself fractured. What if humanity did not invent complexity, but inherited a quiet, broken version of it, pieced together from ruins whose true purpose we no longer recognize? Across the planet, the ground beneath our feet tells a story that textbooks soften and museums fragment. Entire layers of Earth speak of sudden endings, of worlds reshaped overnight by forces too violent, too fast, to fit neatly into timelines drawn with confidence. Stone monuments appear where they should not exist. Myths repeat themselves across continents that never spoke to one another. Floods, fires, collapses, and survivors. Again and again, the same pattern emerges, not as fiction, but as memory wearing the disguise of legend. This is not a search for fantasy, nor a rejection of science, but an invitation to look at familiar evidence from an unfamiliar angle. To ask whether what we call prehistory is not empty space, but a deliberate silence. A silence created by erosion, catastrophe, and time itself. And within that silence, something waits to be re-examined. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. To understand why the idea of forgotten civilizations refuses to disappear, we have to begin with a simple, uncomfortable calculation. Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Complex life has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Modern humans, by contrast, have occupied this planet for a geological blink, roughly 300,000 years. If intelligence and technological capability emerged once, there is nothing in physics, chemistry, or biology that forbids it from emerging earlier, under different conditions, and then vanishing long before we arrived to notice the aftermath. For most of modern history, this possibility was dismissed not because it was impossible, but because it felt unnecessary. Humanity preferred a clean narrative, long ages of simple life, followed by a steady march toward complexity, culminating neatly in us. But in recent years, scientists themselves have begun to ask a more unsettling question. If an industrial civilization existed millions of years ago, would we even be able to detect it today? This question was formalized in what became known as the Silurian Hypothesis, named not after a belief in ancient reptilian beings, but after a geological period that predates mammals by hundreds of millions of years. The hypothesis is not a claim that such a civilization existed. It is a thought experiment designed to test the limits of detection. In other words, it asks whether our methods of reading Earth's history are capable of recognizing technological societies outside our narrow window of time. To grasp why this matters, imagine the sudden disappearance of modern humanity. Cities abandoned, power grids shut down, no maintenance, no repair. Within decades, vegetation would overtake streets and buildings. Within centuries, steel would corrode, concrete would fracture, and glass would shatter into dust. Within a few thousand years, even massive structures would be difficult to distinguish from natural formations. Plastics, often imagined as immortal, would break down into microfragments and disperse into sediments. Radioactive waste, one of the most persistent signatures of our age, would decay beyond easy recognition. Stretch that timeline further, into millions of years, and the picture becomes even bleaker. Plate tectonics would recycle ocean floors, erosion would grind continents down and rebuild them elsewhere. Volcanism would bury surfaces under kilometers of lava and ash. Fossilization, a process that preserves only a vanishingly small fraction of life, would favor bones and shells, not machines and circuits. In this context, the absence of evidence is no longer comforting. It becomes expected. Earth is not a static archive. It is an active editor. Oceans become mountains. Mountains dissolve into plains. What exists on the surface today is not a complete record of the past, but a heavily filtered sample. The oldest oceanic crust we have is about 200 million years old. Anything built before that on the seafloor is gone, subducted into the mantle, erased beyond recovery. On land, preservation is only marginally better. Wind, water, ice, and gravity conspire endlessly to erase detail. If an ancient industrial civilization existed deep in geological time, its roads, cities, and machines would not survive. The Silurian Hypothesis therefore shifts the search away from objects and toward chemistry. Instead of asking where the ruins are, it asks whether large-scale industrial activity would leave subtle fingerprints embedded in the planet itself. One such fingerprint involves isotopes, variants of elements that differ slightly in mass. Carbon, for example, exists primarily as carbon-12 and carbon-13. Biological and industrial processes alter the balance between them in detectable ways. When modern humans burn fossil fuels, we release carbon that was locked away millions of years ago, skewing atmospheric and sedimentary ratios. These changes are already visible in ice cores and ocean sediments. If another industrial civilization burned fossil fuels in the distant past, similar anomalies might be preserved in ancient rock layers. Nitrogen offers another clue. Synthetic fertilizers, essential to modern agriculture, alter nitrogen-15 levels in soils and sediments. A planet-wide agricultural system would leave a chemical echo, even if every plow and field had long since vanished. The same logic applies to certain long-lived radioactive isotopes. Some, like plutonium-244 or iodine-129, have half-lives so long that their presence in ancient geological layers would be difficult to explain without nuclear reactions, whether artificial or natural. But this is where the hypothesis becomes most unsettling. Nearly every chemical signature that might indicate technology can also be produced by natural processes. Volcanoes release vast amounts of carbon dioxide. Methane hydrates destabilize and flood the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Natural nuclear reactors, like the ancient one discovered in Oklo, Gabon, operated billions of years ago without any intelligent intervention. Earth, it turns out, is capable of mimicking its own technology. One of the most dramatic examples is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a global warming event that occurred roughly 56 million years ago. During this period, global temperatures rose sharply, polar regions became subtropical, and massive amounts of carbon entered the atmosphere. At first glance, the event resembles the effects of unchecked industrial activity. This similarity raised an uncomfortable question. If humans can alter the climate this profoundly in a few centuries, could another civilization have done something similar over a longer span of time? closer examination tempers the speculation. The carbon release during the thermal maximum occurred far more slowly than modern emissions. The isotopic patterns align more closely with volcanic activity and natural carbon reservoirs than with fossil fuel combustion. No accompanying traces of synthetic compounds or industrial byproducts have been found. The event, while extreme, fits within the range of what Earth can do to itself. And yet, the thought experiment remains valuable precisely because it fails to give us certainty. It reveals how fragile our confidence really is. The geological record is not a complete chronicle. It is a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and some of the remaining pieces reshaped by time beyond recognition. This uncertainty forces us to confront a deeper idea. Human exceptionalism is not written into the laws of nature. Intelligence is an evolutionary strategy, not a cosmic destiny reserved for one species at one moment. If intelligence arose before, it could have risen quietly, flourished briefly, and disappeared so thoroughly that only ambiguous traces remain. Not ruins to marvel at, but questions embedded in stone. In this light, the real significance of the Silurian hypothesis is not whether it proves the existence of ancient civilizations, but whether it exposes the limits of our detection. It reminds us that history, when stretched across planetary timescales, becomes less like a storybook and more like a crime scene after a flood. Evidence scattered, context erased, conclusions tentative at best. What we call prehistory may not be a blank page. It may be a palimpsest, written over so many times that only faint impressions remain. And if that is true, then the search for lost civilizations is not about chasing fantasies, but about learning how to read a planet that is very good at forgetting. If Earth is capable of erasing entire technological ages, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What forms of intelligence might have existed before us, and how would we recognize them if they left no cities, no tools, no obvious ruins? This question forces us to abandon the comforting assumption that intelligence must always look like modern humanity, complete with steel, concrete, and electricity. Evolution is inventive. It does not repeat itself neatly. For decades, paleontology portrayed dinosaurs as little more than oversized reptiles, impressive in scale but limited in cognition. That image has eroded under closer scrutiny. Fossilized nesting grounds reveal organized care for offspring. Bone growth patterns suggest long-term social structures rather than solitary existence. Trackways show coordinated movement, not chaotic wandering. These clues do not suggest industrial society, but they do challenge the idea that intelligence is exclusively mammalian or human-shaped. One dinosaur in particular has attracted sustained attention. A small bird-like predator known for its disproportionately large brain relative to body size. Its skull structure implies binocular vision, allowing depth perception. Its hands, equipped with semi-opposable digits, suggest the ability to manipulate objects with precision. In modern animals, this combination is rare and usually associated with complex problem-solving. If such a species had survived long enough, evolutionary pressures could have driven it toward increasingly sophisticated behavior. This line of thinking led some researchers to explore a purely hypothetical scenario: a non-avian dinosaur lineage that escaped extinction and continued evolving for tens of millions of years. The result was not a claim, but a model. a thought experiment imagining how intelligence might express itself under different anatomical constraints. The exercise was unsettling, not because it proved anything, but because it demonstrated how thin the line really is between what we accept as plausible and what we dismiss as impossible. Yet intelligence does not require bones, claws, or eyes at all. One of the most disturbing discoveries of modern biology is how problem-solving can emerge in systems with no central brain. Slime molds, for example, are single-celled organisms that can solve mazes, optimize pathways, and remember past conditions. When placed in a labyrinth with food at one end, these organisms extend tendrils in every direction, retract inefficient paths, and settle on the shortest route. They do this without neurons, synapses, or anything resembling thought as we understand it. Fungi push this concept even further. Vast underground networks connect forests, transferring nutrients and chemical signals between plants. These networks respond to environmental stress, allocate resources strategically, and adapt to threats. In functional terms, they behave less like passive life forms and more like distributed intelligence systems. If such organisms dominated a planet before complex animals arose, their form of civilization would leave no buildings, no monuments, and no artifacts we would recognize as technological. Their intelligence would be written in chemistry and structure, not architecture. This forces a radical shift in perspective. When we search for ancient civilizations, we often assume they must resemble us. But intelligence does not require cities or metallurgy. It requires information processing, adaptation, and agency. A civilization based on biological networks rather than machines would not pollute the atmosphere with plastics or leave radioactive waste. It would integrate into ecosystems so completely that its collapse would appear indistinguishable from natural change. Even within our own lineage, the archaeological record reveals uncomfortable gaps. There are periods when tool sophistication appears to stall for tens of thousands of years, followed by sudden bursts of innovation. These leaps are often explained as cultural breakthroughs, but they also raise questions about lost knowledge. Techniques can vanish when populations shrink, climates shift, or trade networks collapse. What disappears on a small scale in human history could vanish entirely on a planetary scale. This is where myths and ancient narratives become relevant, not as literal records, but as cultural residues. Flood stories appear across continents, told by societies with no contact. They share striking similarities: a warning, a deluge, survival, and renewal. Such consistency suggests shared experience rather than coincidence. Geological evidence supports the reality of massive floods at the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers released unimaginable volumes of water. Entire coastlines were submerged. Habitable land vanished in generations. If early human societies lived along those coasts, their settlements would now lie underwater, inaccessible and eroded. Their disappearance would look sudden, total, and mythic. Over time, memory would compress catastrophe into story. The flood becomes not just a disaster, but a reset, a dividing line between what came before and what followed. This pattern mirrors what we see in stone. Around the world, ancient sites display a curious feature. The deepest layers are often the most precisely built. Massive stone blocks fitted so tightly that modern tools struggle to replicate them. Above these foundations sit cruder additions, built by later cultures using smaller stones and simpler techniques. This inversion of sophistication challenges the assumption of linear progress. It suggests inheritance rather than invention. Such structures appear in South America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Their builders left no inscriptions explaining their methods. Their tools, if they existed, did not survive. What remains is geometry, alignment, and scale. Stone does not lie easily, but it also does not explain itself. The temptation is to fill these gaps with certainty, to declare lost civilizations as fact or dismiss them as fantasy. Both extremes miss the point. The real lesson is that history is fragile. Knowledge can vanish faster than species. A society does not need to be global or industrial to leave an outsized imprint on memory. It only needs to end abruptly. If intelligence existed before us in any form, it may not announce itself with monuments. It may whisper through patterns we barely understand. Through anomalies in stonework, sudden absences in the fossil record, and stories that refuse to fade. These are not proofs, they are provocations. And they force us to ask whether the story of intelligence on Earth is a single chapter, or a book whose earlier pages have been torn out. By the 19th century, the idea that civilization might have roots deeper than accepted history began to resurface in unexpected ways. This was not driven by mysticism at first, but by archaeology itself. As European scholars excavated the ruins of the Americas, they encountered structures that did not sit comfortably within the prevailing narrative of human development. The scale, symmetry, and apparent antiquity of these sites suggested knowledge that seemed disproportionate to the tools attributed to their builders. One of the earliest voices to push this discomfort into public debate was a French scholar who spent years studying the remnants of Mesoamerican cultures. While examining Mayan inscriptions and architectural layouts, he noticed repeated references to an ancestral homeland described not as a city or kingdom, but as a vast land that existed before known civilizations. According to his interpretation, this place was not symbolic, it was geographic. A motherland whose collapse scattered survivors across the globe. The claim was explosive, not because it was detailed, but because it was incomplete. No coordinates, no physical remains, only fragments of translated text and an assertion that Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the civilizations of the Americas shared a common origin far older than history admitted. Without hard evidence, the idea was dismissed as speculative at best, but it planted a seed. That seed took root in the mind of a British writer who would later devote his life to the concept of a lost Pacific civilization. While stationed in colonial India, he claimed to have encountered temple priests who guarded ancient stone tablets written in a language no longer spoken. These tablets, he said, told the story of a continent called Mu, a land where humanity itself first emerged into organized society. According to his account, the tablets described a civilization tens of thousands of years old, technologically advanced for its time, unified under a single system of governance, and populated by millions. Mu, he argued, was not a myth, but a real landmass that once stretched across the Pacific Ocean. Its people were said to have possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and spiritual science, knowledge later carried to distant continents after a catastrophic collapse. The description was vivid. Massive cities, carefully planned colonies, a culture that blended scientific understanding with ritual practice, and then sudden annihilation. Earthquakes, volcanic upheaval, the land sinking beneath the sea in what was described as a single night of devastation. Survivors fled, carrying fragments of their knowledge to places that would later become Egypt, India, and the Americas. The story captivated readers precisely because it mirrored older myths, a golden age, a fall, a scattering of wisdom. But fascination is not evidence, and the academic response was swift. Geologists pointed out that continents do not simply sink. Plate tectonics, the slow movement of Earth's crust, does not allow for a landmass the size described to vanish rapidly without leaving unmistakable traces. The Pacific seafloor, extensively mapped, shows no sign of a submerged continent matching the proposed scale. Linguists raised additional concerns. Languages evolve through traceable patterns. If civilizations across the world shared a common origin as recently as 12,000 years ago, genetic and linguistic markers should persist. Yet no clear link connects the languages of the Pacific, the Americas, and the ancient Old World in the way the theory demands. Without independent verification of the tablets themselves, the entire narrative rested on trust. And yet, the story refused to disappear. Part of its resilience lies in geography. The Pacific is vast, deeper and less explored than any other ocean. While no sunken continent exists, there are submerged plateaus, island chains, and drowned coastlines. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, submerging enormous areas of habitable land. Regions like Sundaland in Southeast Asia once connected islands into a single sprawling landmass. When the ice melted, that world vanished beneath the waves. To the people who lived there, the loss would have felt total. Ancestral lands gone, settlements erased, memory transformed into legend. Over generations, a drowned homeland becomes a story of divine punishment or cosmic reset. In this sense, Mu may not describe a continent that sank whole, but a collective memory of multiple drowned worlds compressed into one name. Physical structures add another layer of unease. Across the Pacific, monumental stone statues stand isolated on remote islands. The most famous are enormous human-like figures carved from volcanic rock, weighing tens of tons each. Local traditions say they honor ancestors who came from afar, beings who possessed great knowledge. The methods used to carve and transport these statues remain debated, but their existence alone challenges assumptions about what small, isolated populations could achieve with limited resources. Further afield, pyramidal structures appear on nearly every continent. They vary in age, size, and purpose, yet share striking similarities in form and alignment. Built thousands of years apart by cultures with no confirmed contact, they follow the same basic geometric principles. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to convergent problem-solving, the idea that humans independently arrive at similar solutions. But the repetition still invites scrutiny. Stone foundations beneath later buildings often display superior craftsmanship. Larger blocks, tighter joints, greater precision. The civilizations credited with these structures frequently appear to have inherited them rather than originated them. In such cases, history reads less like invention and more like reuse. Knowledge passed down, partially understood, then gradually lost. The legend of Mu occupies an uncomfortable middle ground between myth and misinterpretation. Taken literally, It collapses under scientific scrutiny. Taken symbolically, it aligns disturbingly well with what we know about rising seas, lost coastlines, and cultural amnesia. It becomes less a story about a single vanished continent and more a warning about how easily worlds can disappear without leaving a clear trace. What makes this idea dangerous to conventional history is not that it proves an ancient global civilization existed, but that it undermines confidence in clean timelines. It suggests that human memory extends further than our monuments, and that catastrophe can erase complexity faster than we are prepared to admit. Mu, whether real or not, functions as a mirror. It reflects our anxiety about fragility, about how quickly progress can be undone, and about the possibility that what we called the beginning of civilization may actually be a restart, built atop the ruins of something we no longer know how to see. Long before modern debates about lost civilizations took shape, one ancient voice introduced an idea that would echo across centuries with unsettling persistence. This voice belonged to a philosopher whose work still forms the backbone of Western thought. When he wrote about an advanced society that vanished beneath the sea, he did not frame it as myth or poetry. He presented it as inherited knowledge, passed down through generations, preserved by priests, and recorded with deliberate precision. In two dialogues, he described a powerful island civilization that existed thousands of years before his time. This land was said to lie beyond a narrow sea passage, larger than known continents combined, commanding territories across oceans. Its people possessed advanced engineering, sophisticated governance, and immense wealth. They built concentric cities, canals, harbors, and temples with a level of organization that rivals modern urban planning. Their downfall came suddenly, erased by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. What makes this account difficult to dismiss is not its grandeur, but its specificity. The narrative names real places, uses measurable distances, and situates events within a broader historical context. The philosopher insisted the story was not his invention, but knowledge brought from Egypt, where priests claimed to maintain records stretching back 9,000 years. In ancient cultures, priests were archivists, not storytellers. Their role was to preserve continuity through catastrophe. For centuries, scholars treated the account as allegory, a moral lesson disguised as history. This interpretation was convenient. It allowed the story to exist without challenging established timelines. But allegories do not require geographic precision. They do not demand dates, measurements, or inherited chains of transmission. This tension has never been fully resolved. Geology became the primary tool used to reject the account. Critics argued that no island of such size could sink suddenly without leaving clear evidence. Continents move slowly. Oceans form over millions of years. Yet this objection assumes that the description refers to a single, massive landmass disappearing whole. It does not consider the possibility that the account compresses multiple events into one narrative, or that translation across centuries altered scale and location. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastal regions that had supported human habitation for thousands of years vanished beneath the ocean. Entire cultures were displaced or destroyed. This was not a slow process from a human perspective. In some regions, shorelines retreated kilometers within a few generations. To those who lived through it, the world did not gradually change. It ended. One such region lay near the mouth of the Mediterranean. Geological evidence shows that catastrophic flooding occurred when ocean waters breached natural barriers, filling basins rapidly and violently. Settlements would have been obliterated. Survivors would have fled inland, carrying memories of a homeland consumed by the sea. Over time, these memories would be retold, refined, and preserved as sacred history. Stone offers further hints. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, ancient structures display engineering that appears abruptly, fully formed, then declines. Massive blocks weighing tens or hundreds of tons were shaped and placed with extraordinary precision. Later cultures reused these foundations, but lacked the means or knowledge to replicate them. This pattern repeats in Egypt, the Levant, and parts of Europe. The oldest work is often the most refined. The philosopher's account also emphasized moral decline. The civilization's fall was not only physical, but ethical. Prosperity bred excess. Discipline eroded. Harmony gave way to greed. This framing aligns with how societies remember collapse. Catastrophe is rarely recalled as random. It is moralized, transformed into a lesson about imbalance and consequence. This does not invalidate the event itself. It reveals how humans process trauma. Across cultures, flood narratives share the same structure: a warning, a deluge, survival through foresight or divine favor, a new beginning in a changed world. These stories appear in Mesopotamia, South Asia, East Asia, the Americas, and beyond. They are not identical, but their core elements are consistent enough to suggest a shared experiential root. Oral traditions are not designed to preserve dates. They preserve meaning. Modern geology confirms that immense floods occurred near the end of the Ice Age. In North America, landscapes were scoured by torrents released when glacial dams failed. Water moved faster than rivers ever should, carving channels and leaving ripple marks the size of buildings. Similar evidence exists in other regions. These were not seasonal floods. They were planetary events. When catastrophe operates at this scale, it does more than destroy settlements. It resets memory. Knowledge encoded in fragile systems like writing, architecture, and social organization collapses. What survives is not technology, but story, not infrastructure, but myth. Over generations, advanced understanding degrades into symbol, then into legend. This context reframes the account of a vanished island civilization. It may not describe a technologically futuristic society, as later imagination would embellish it. It may describe something both simpler and more advanced in different ways. A culture with deep astronomical knowledge, sophisticated stoneworking, and complex social systems, thriving along now submerged coastlines. When the waters rose, it fell, not because it was unique, but because it was exposed. What remains today are fragments, stone alignments that track solstices, foundations too massive for their supposed builders, cultural memories that speak of teachers arriving from the sea, bringing agriculture, law, and cosmology. These figures appear in different forms across continents, always emerging after catastrophe, always associated with renewal. The philosopher's story endures because it sits at the intersection of geology, memory, and loss. It challenges the idea that history begins where writing appears. It suggests that entire chapters of human experience may lie beneath the ocean, inaccessible not because they are imaginary, but because they are inconvenient to recover. Atlantis, stripped of fantasy, becomes something quieter and more troubling. Not a lost utopia of crystal towers, but a reminder that civilization is older, more fragile, and more cyclical than we prefer to believe. It is not a destination on a map. It is a shadow cast by a past that did not survive intact, yet refuses to be forgotten. When ancient stone refuses to explain itself, memory steps in to fill the gaps. This is where catastrophe becomes the central mechanism of forgetting, not as metaphor, but as a physical force that reshapes landscapes and amputates history. To understand how entire phases of civilization can vanish, we must stop imagining collapse as slow decline and start seeing it as sudden interruption. At the end of the last ice age, the planet entered a period of violent instability. Massive ice sheets that had locked up fresh water for tens of thousands of years began to fail. When they did, the release was not gentle. Natural dams collapsed, unleashing walls of water that moved faster than modern rivers and carried enough force to strip bedrock bare. These events were not local curiosities. They were continental-scale disasters. One of the clearest examples lies in the interior of North America, where vast tracts of land appear as if they were clawed open. Dry channels snake across terrain that receives little rainfall. Hills are smoothed into giant ripples, each one as tall as a multi-story building. For decades, geologists struggled to explain these formations using slow erosion. The evidence simply did not fit. Eventually, it became undeniable that only catastrophic flooding could have produced such features. The water responsible did not trickle, it surged. Entire regions were submerged in days. Anything built along river valleys or coastal plains would have been erased instantly. Settlements would not decay, they would disintegrate. Survivors would have fled with little more than memory, and memory under trauma does not preserve detail. It preserves meaning. Similar flood evidence appears elsewhere. Large inland seas formed and vanished. Coastlines retreated dramatically. Land bridges that once connected continents disappeared beneath rising oceans. These were not abstract geological processes. They were lived experiences for the humans who occupied those regions. Families displaced, traditions broken, knowledge systems severed. This is where myth becomes history's shadow. When societies lose their material foundations, they compress experience into story. A flood becomes a single event, even if it unfolded over generations. A vanished homeland becomes a sacred origin. Teachers who survived become gods. The language changes, but the core remains. Across cultures, flood stories share striking similarities, not because people copied each other, but because the event itself was shared. Warning signs, rising waters, chosen survivors, renewal on higher ground. These narratives are not precise because precision is not the goal. Survival is. Oral tradition is optimized to transmit lessons, not data. Geology confirms that these floods were not uniform. Some were glacial outbursts, others were triggered by rising seas breaching natural barriers. Some regions were drowned slowly. Others were annihilated overnight. From a human perspective, the difference matters little. The world before ceased to exist. If an advanced coastal culture existed prior to these events, it would have been among the first casualties. Coastal plains are fertile, stable, and ideal for long-term settlement. They are also the most vulnerable to rising seas. When the ice melted, these regions did not retreat gracefully. They vanished. Underwater archaeology has already revealed submerged settlements off the coasts of Europe and Asia. Stone tools, walls, foundations, These are not myths. They are real, and they are only the shallowest examples. Beyond them lie deeper shelves, unexplored and eroded, where older traces would be harder to recognize. Technology does not fossilize easily. Wood rots, metal corrodes, ceramics fracture, even stone structures collapse and scatter. Once submerged, currents and sediment grind them down further. After thousands of years, what remains may not look like a city. It may look like an anomaly, a shape dismissed as natural. This is why the absence of obvious ruins cannot be treated as evidence of absence. The archaeological record is biased toward continuity. It favors societies that endured long enough to rebuild. Cultures erased quickly leave almost nothing behind. What survives catastrophe best is not technology, but patterns, astronomical alignments, geometric layouts, construction principles. These can be transmitted without writing, preserved through ritual and imitation. When survivors rebuilt inland, they would have carried these patterns with them, adapting them to new materials and conditions. Over time, the original rationale fades. What was once functional becomes symbolic. What was once technical becomes sacred. A structure aligned to the stars becomes a temple. A calendar becomes a myth cycle. Precision persists. Purpose blurs. This process explains why later civilizations often revered ancient structures without understanding them. They did not build them. They inherited them. They repaired them, repurposed them, and wove them into their cosmologies. To do otherwise would have been unthinkable. You do not dismantle the work of the ancestors who survived the end of the world. Catastrophe also explains why progress appears to reset. After collapse, populations shrink. Specialization vanishes. Knowledge fragments. Techniques that require coordination across generations disappear first. What remains are portable skills: farming, toolmaking, storytelling. From this perspective, civilization is not a straight line. It is a pulse. It surges, stabilizes, and then is cut short by forces outside its control. When it returns, it does so in a diminished form, unaware of what was lost. This does not require invoking fantastical technology or impossible societies. It requires accepting that humans, like all complex systems, are vulnerable to environmental shock, that we have faced it before, and that each time history did not restart cleanly. It limped forward, carrying scars. The question is not whether catastrophe erased an earlier phase of civilization. The geological record confirms that it erased entire landscapes. The real question is how much of ourselves we have already forgotten, and how much of what we call the beginning is simply what survived. The past does not vanish politely. It breaks. And when it does, it leaves behind silence, stone, and stories that refuse to align neatly because they were never meant to. They were meant to endure long enough to warn us. As the waters receded and climates stabilized, humanity did not begin from nothing. It began from fragments. Survivors carried skills that could travel on foot and in memory, not the vast systems that required stable coastlines, dense populations, and uninterrupted time. Agriculture returned because seeds could be saved. Stonework returned because hands remembered motion. Astronomy returned because the sky never changed its patterns. What did not return were the deeper frameworks that tied these elements into a single, coherent system. This explains a recurring paradox in ancient history. Early societies often display sudden sophistication, followed by long plateaus or decline. Techniques appear fully formed, then stagnate. Measurement systems are precise, yet writing is absent or rudimentary. Architecture shows planning, but documentation is missing. These are not signs of primitive beginnings. They are signs of inheritance under constraint. In regions where catastrophe was most severe, the break is most visible. Along river valleys reshaped by flood, early settlements emerge with surprising complexity, only to simplify over time. Tools become less specialized. Construction becomes more modular. Knowledge that once required coordinated effort across generations becomes impossible to sustain. This is not failure. It is adaptation to scarcity. Oral transmission plays a central role here. When writing systems collapse or never take root, information must be encoded in narrative, ritual, and repetition. Practical knowledge becomes mythic because myth survives where manuals do not. A calendar becomes a god's journey across the sky. An engineering principle becomes a sacred proportion. The original reason fades, but the pattern persists. This process is visible in the way ancient cultures treated geometry. Certain ratios appear again and again in architecture and art, embedded not as equations but as aesthetic rules. Builders followed them because they were taught to, not because they understood their origin. Over time, geometry ceased to be a tool and became a symbol of order itself. Precision survived without explanation. Astronomy followed the same path. Observational knowledge of solstices, equinoxes, and stellar cycles was critical for agriculture and navigation. These observations were preserved because they mattered. But the broader cosmological models that once unified sky, land, and society fractured. What remained were festivals, alignments, and stories tied to celestial events. The system endured, the theory vanished. In some cultures, the arrival of knowledge is attributed to civilizing figures who appear after chaos. They teach farming, law, and building. They establish order, then depart. These figures are not remembered as inventors, but as restorers. Their role is to reassemble fragments, not to create from nothing. The emphasis is always on recovery. Archaeology reveals this recovery process in layers. Earlier strata show ambitious construction and complex planning. Later layers reuse materials, simplify layouts, and adapt old foundations. This is often misread as gradual improvement from simplicity to complexity. The stone tells a different story. Complexity comes first, then reduction. Environmental stability eventually allows societies to rebuild sophistication, but the new systems are not identical to the old. They develop independently, constrained by altered landscapes and lost context. This is why later civilizations can achieve greatness without replicating earlier methods. They are solving similar problems under different conditions. The danger lies in assuming that continuity equals origin. When a culture builds atop ancient foundations, it inherits not only stone, but authority. The structures become sacred because they predate memory. Questioning their origin becomes taboo. Over time, the builders of the upper layers become credited with the entire complex. History compresses. This compression is reinforced by written records. Writing appears sporadically and often late. When it does, it records what exists at the moment, not what was lost before. The written word freezes a snapshot and presents it as a beginning. Everything prior becomes prehistory, a term that suggests emptiness rather than erasure. Geology contradicts this implication. Earth's surface bears the scars of repeated disruption. Sediment layers show abrupt transitions. Ecosystems collapse and reassemble. Human societies are not exempt from these forces. They are embedded within them. Civilization is not an exception to nature. It is subject to it. Understanding this reframes progress. Advancement is not guaranteed. It is conditional. It depends on climate stability, resource access, and uninterrupted transmission of knowledge. Remove any one of these, and complexity collapses rapidly. The idea of inevitable progress is a modern illusion born from an unusually stable period. When stability returns, memory does not. New societies inherit the world, not its instructions. They experiment, rediscover, and sometimes stumble upon echoes of what once was. When they do, those echoes feel uncanny. Techniques seem out of place. Monuments feel too old. Stories feel too familiar. This is why debates about lost civilizations persist. They are not driven solely by fantasy. They are driven by mismatches between expectation and evidence. When stone speaks a language more advanced than the culture credited with it, the tension demands resolution. Dismissing it outright does not resolve it. It only postpones understanding. The past does not announce itself clearly. It leaves residue, patterns, gaps. When catastrophe intervenes, it does not politely archive what it destroys. It scatters it. Reconstruction is always partial. What we call origins may simply be the oldest chapter that survived intact. Recognizing this does not diminish human achievement. It deepens it. It places humanity within a long cycle of learning, forgetting, and relearning. It suggests that our ancestors were not naive beginners, but inheritors navigating a damaged world. Civilization, then, is not a ladder. It is a waveform shaped by forces larger than any single society. Each rise carries the imprint of earlier peaks, distorted by loss. Each fall erases more than it preserves. The stones endure because they are heavy. Knowledge endures only when conditions allow it to breathe. What remains today is not a complete story, but enough fragments to suggest that beginnings are rarely as simple as they appear. The silence between layers is not empty. It is where the past waits, unfinished, beneath our feet. As fragmented societies stabilized and began to expand again, something curious happened across the ancient world. Similar systems of knowledge emerged in places separated by vast distances, often appearing suddenly and without clear local precursors. Agriculture, monumental architecture, astronomy, and law crystallized within relatively short spans of time. These developments are usually framed as independent inventions, but the timing and structure suggest a more complicated inheritance. In multiple regions, early civilizations describe their origins not as inventions, but as restorations. Knowledge arrives already formed, delivered by figures remembered as teachers rather than founders. These figures do not claim authorship. They transmit, they organize, they instruct communities in farming cycles, measurement, stoneworking, and social order. Once their task is complete, they vanish from the record. In the Nile Valley, tradition speaks of civilizing sages who established geometry, writing, and calendar systems tied precisely to celestial cycles. In Mesoamerica, similar figures are remembered for introducing agriculture, timekeeping, and ethical law. Along the Andes, ancestral accounts describe culture bringers emerging after chaos, reshaping scattered populations into organized societies. The details vary, but the structure of the memory remains consistent. What unites these traditions is not mythology in the modern sense, but function. These narratives preserve the idea that civilization was reassembled, not invented from nothing. The teachers are not gods demanding worship. They are intermediaries between a lost order and a damaged present. Their authority comes from knowledge, not power. Archaeological evidence aligns with this pattern. Early urban centers often appear with advanced planning already in place. Gridded layouts, water management systems, and ceremonial architecture arise rapidly. There is little evidence of gradual experimentation. Instead, there is implementation. This suggests access to templates, not trial and error. Genetic studies add a subtle layer to this picture. Human populations expanded rapidly after the last ice age, carrying shared lineages across continents. Coastal migration routes allowed ideas to travel alongside people. When rising seas submerged these routes, inland populations inherited both survivors and stories. Cultural transmission followed paths that are now underwater. Linguistic analysis, while often cited as evidence against deep common origins, reveals something else when examined carefully. Core concepts related to measurement, cosmology, and ritual recur in symbolic form even when vocabulary diverges. Words change quickly. Structures of meaning do not. This is why similar numerical systems, geometric motifs, and mythic cycles appear in unrelated language families. Stone once again provides the most stubborn testimony. Early monuments across the world emphasize durability and alignment rather than decoration. Their builders prioritized permanence and cosmic orientation. This suggests a worldview shaped by instability, one that sought to anchor human order to celestial regularity. When the ground itself cannot be trusted, the sky becomes reference. Over time, this worldview fragments. Later cultures inherit monuments but reinterpret their meaning. What was once a functional alignment becomes symbolic. What was once a calendar becomes a myth. The structure remains, but its original role dissolves into ritual. This transformation explains why later societies often revered ancient sites without fully understanding them. They sensed significance without context. These places felt older than memory, imbued with authority precisely because their origin lay beyond explanation. The past became sacred because it was inaccessible. As populations grew and technologies redeveloped independently, new systems replaced old ones. Writing emerged to stabilize administration. Metals replaced stone as primary tools. Knowledge became specialized again. But the deep continuity was broken. The memory of earlier frameworks survived only in fragments. This process also explains why later civilizations sometimes rediscovered principles already embedded in ancient structures. Mathematical ratios reappear. Astronomical cycles are recalculated. Engineering solutions mirror older ones. These are not coincidences. They are convergences shaped by the same environmental and biological constraints. Civilization does not evolve in isolation. It evolves within a physical world that rewards certain solutions and punishes others. When earlier societies found effective ways to organize space, time, and resources, those solutions left traces. Later societies stumbled upon them again, unaware they were walking familiar ground. The illusion of linear progress arises because written history privileges continuity. It records what persists, not what vanished. When a collapse erases writing, the next written record appears later and claims primacy. Everything before becomes shadow. This is not deception. It is structural bias. Understanding this bias changes how we read the past. Instead of asking where civilization began, we begin to see how often it restarted. Each restart carried echoes of previous attempts, distorted by loss and adaptation. Innovation blended with inheritance so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. This perspective does not require belief in a single lost global empire. It requires acknowledging that human history is punctuated by resets, each one narrowing the bandwidth of memory. What survives these resets shapes the next phase, but never completely. The result is a layered world. Beneath familiar timelines lie earlier configurations, hinted at by stone, myth, and alignment. These hints are not blueprints. They are reminders that human organization has deep roots, and that those roots have been cut more than once. When we encounter ancient knowledge that seems to appear too early or too suddenly, the explanation may not be mystery or miracle. It may be inheritance without context. Knowledge surviving catastrophe not as instruction, but as imprint. Civilization remembers through fragments. It rebuilds using what remains. And in doing so, it creates the illusion of beginning anew. Even as it walks across the foundations of worlds, it no longer knows by name. As civilizations rebuilt and expanded inland, another pattern emerged that complicates the story even further. While societies diverged culturally, spiritually, and linguistically, their deepest symbolic structures began to mirror one another with uncanny precision. This was not limited to architecture or astronomy. It extended into mathematics, cosmology, and the way reality itself was conceptualized. Across ancient cultures, numbers were not merely tools for counting. They carried meaning. Certain values recurred with obsessive consistency. Ratios governing harmony in music appeared in temple layouts. Geometric forms used to divide land mirrored those used to map the heavens. These were not decorative choices. They were frameworks for understanding existence. In several early societies, space was divided according to cardinal directions tied to celestial movement. Cities were laid out as living diagrams of the cosmos. The center represented balance, the perimeter marked chaos. Human life unfolded as an echo of larger cycles believed to govern the universe itself. This worldview did not emerge from superstition. It emerged from long observation. Astronomy, in particular, reveals a depth of continuity that defies simple explanation. Ancient observers tracked planetary motions with astonishing accuracy. They recorded long cycles that exceed a human lifetime. To do this requires institutional memory, not isolated genius. It requires a tradition of observation preserved across generations. What is striking is how these systems appear already mature when they first enter the archaeological record. There is little evidence of early experimentation or error. Calendars align with solar and lunar cycles precisely. Predictions match observation. This suggests inheritance of a refined system rather than its spontaneous invention. When such systems collapse, they do not disappear completely. They degrade. Precision becomes approximation. Theory becomes ritual. Over time, what was once predictive becomes symbolic. The calendar becomes a festival. The observation becomes a myth. The underlying structure remains, but its function shifts. This transformation explains why later cultures often preserved astronomical knowledge in encoded forms. Stories of gods traveling across the sky preserve planetary motion. Tales of death and rebirth mirror solar cycles. These narratives are not metaphors invented for entertainment. They are mnemonic devices designed to survive the loss of formal instruction. Geometry followed a similar path. Certain proportions appear repeatedly in ancient construction, not because builders calculated them consciously, but because they inherited templates shaped by earlier optimization. When these proportions worked, they were repeated. When the reasoning behind them was lost, they were sanctified. In this way, knowledge became sacred not because it was mystical, but because it was irreplaceable. Once lost, it could not easily be reconstructed. Protecting it required ritual, tradition, and taboo. Change was dangerous. Innovation risked forgetting what little remained. This helps explain the conservatism of many ancient cultures. From a modern perspective, resistance to change appears irrational. From a post-catastrophe perspective, it is survival. When the world has already ended once, stability becomes sacred. Environmental evidence supports this mindset. After the last major climatic upheavals, conditions stabilized enough to allow agriculture to flourish. But stability did not mean safety. Memory of chaos lingered. Societies organized themselves to prevent imbalance, often embedding environmental awareness into religious law. Flood cycles, drought patterns, and seasonal shifts were monitored obsessively. Deviations were interpreted as warnings. This vigilance was not superstition. It was the legacy of lived catastrophe encoded into culture. Over time, as generations passed without disaster, the urgency faded. Systems persisted, but their origin stories changed. What began as practical safeguards became divine commandments. What began as environmental monitoring became prophecy. The deeper continuity is visible in how civilizations treated time itself. Many ancient cultures viewed time not as linear, but cyclical. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are born and destroyed. Renewal follows collapse. This worldview aligns with geological reality far more closely than linear progress narratives. Such a conception of time does not emerge easily. It reflects long exposure to repeated disruption. A culture that has experienced total collapse will not believe in permanence. It will believe in return. This cyclical view appears in regions with no contact, expressed through different symbols but identical structure. World ages, golden eras, floods, renewal. This repetition suggests memory layered across millennia, not coincidence. When writing eventually emerged as a dominant tool, it froze these concepts into doctrine. What had once been adaptive memory became theology. What had once been observational science became myth. The written word preserved form, but not function. As societies grew more complex again, specialization returned. Knowledge fragmented into disciplines, astronomy separated from ritual, geometry separated from cosmology. This separation accelerated innovation, but it also severed continuity. The integrated worldview of earlier systems was lost. This loss is visible in the tension between ancient precision and later misunderstanding. Structures align perfectly, but later cultures can no longer explain why. Calendars remain accurate, but their calibration becomes ritualized rather than adjusted. The machine runs, but no one knows how it was built. Modern science often approaches these remnants with skepticism, assuming that coincidence or independent invention explains the similarities. Yet when coincidence repeats across continents and epochs, it stops being coincidence. It becomes signal. This signal does not point to a single lost empire or unified global culture. It points to a shared human experience shaped by environmental collapse and recovery. Knowledge traveled with survivors. It fragmented, adapted, and reassembled under new conditions. What we inherit today is not the product of a single beginning, but of multiple resets layered atop one another. Each reset erased context while preserving structure. Each rebuild mistook inheritance for innovation. Understanding this does not diminish the achievements of later civilizations. It reveals their resilience. They rebuilt meaning from fragments, stabilized systems without full knowledge, and carried humanity forward despite catastrophic loss. The past did not end cleanly. It fractured. And in those fractures, patterns endured, quietly guiding civilizations that no longer remembered where the patterns came from, only that they worked. As human societies regained stability and expanded their reach, another anomaly emerged that refuses to sit comfortably within conventional timelines. Certain ancient structures do not merely show sophistication. They display engineering decisions that appear optimized rather than improvised. These decisions suggest long-term experimentation that is invisible in the archaeological record, as if the trial and error phase occurred somewhere else at another time, now erased. Consider the movement of massive stone blocks. Across the ancient world, stones weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons were quarried, transported, and placed with accuracy that leaves little margin for error. The logistics required are not mysterious in isolation. Humans, ropes, sleds, and leverage can accomplish remarkable feats. What is puzzling is consistency. The same challenges were solved in nearly identical ways across environments that should have encouraged different solutions. In many cases, the quarries lie far from the construction sites. Transport paths are unclear or non-existent. Some stones were moved uphill, others across uneven terrain, yet damage is minimal. Edges remain sharp, surfaces remain flat. This implies controlled movement, not brute dragging. The solutions used were effective enough to be repeated reliably, not rediscovered each time. When modern engineers analyze these sites, they often focus on what could work rather than what was likely used. This approach solves the problem mathematically, but avoids the historical question. Engineering feasibility does not equal historical reality. Just because something can be done with simple tools does not mean it was done that way repeatedly, across continents, without leaving developmental traces. The absence of intermediate experimentation is striking. We do not see gradual increases in stone size, complexity, or precision within a single cultural sequence. Instead, we see a peak followed by simplification. Early work is bold and exact. Later additions are cautious and derivative. This reversal is the opposite of what independent innovation predicts. One explanation is lost technique. Skills can vanish when social structures collapse. A method that requires coordination, specialized training, and shared standards is fragile. Remove the system that sustains it, and the technique disappears, even if the result remains visible in stone. Catastrophe accelerates this loss. When populations shrink and disperse, specialists are lost first. Knowledge that depends on collective memory fragments rapidly. What remains are impressions of capability, not instructions. Later builders copy what they see without understanding how it was achieved. This process produces imitation without mastery. Stones are shaped to resemble earlier forms but lack the same precision. Layouts mimic older plans but drift over time. The intent survives. The execution degrades. Archaeology captures this decline clearly, but often misinterprets it as gradual improvement in reverse chronological order. Water management systems offer another clue. Ancient canals, reservoirs, and drainage networks often display integration at a scale that suggests centralized planning. In some regions, these systems predate written administration. They are laid out as if designed in a single conceptual pass, not pieced together over generations. Such coordination requires a shared mental model of landscape behavior. Understanding how water moves through terrain is not intuitive. It comes from observation across many seasonal cycles. Embedding that knowledge into permanent infrastructure implies stability over time. The absence of written documentation suggests that the knowledge was carried differently, perhaps orally, perhaps ritually, perhaps through apprenticeship. When such systems fail or are abandoned, later societies often reuse fragments without restoring the whole. Canals are repurposed. Reservoirs are maintained unevenly. Flood control degrades. Over time, the system loses resilience. Environmental stress increases. The cycle begins again. Geological evidence confirms that environmental stress was not hypothetical. Climate records show abrupt shifts in rainfall and temperature. Droughts followed floods. Regions that were once fertile became marginal. Societies adapted or collapsed depending on their flexibility and memory. This environmental volatility explains why ancient cultures placed such emphasis on balance. Architecture, ritual, and law all reinforced stability. Excess was warned against. Disruption was feared. These were not moral abstractions. They were survival strategies encoded in culture. The further back we look, the more civilization appears as a response to instability rather than comfort. Order was not taken for granted. It was constructed deliberately, often redundantly, to withstand shock. When it failed, the consequences were absolute. Modern perspectives often assume that earlier humans lacked long-term planning because their tools were simple. The archaeological record suggests the opposite. Planning existed, but its artifacts were vulnerable. What survives best is stone, and stone preserves outcomes, not processes. This bias distorts interpretation. We see finished monuments without seeing the systems that made them possible. We attribute achievement to isolated genius rather than sustained tradition. We mistake the absence of evidence for evidence of absence. If earlier societies developed effective methods for construction, water management, and alignment, those methods may have been transmitted briefly, then lost. Their disappearance does not negate their existence. It confirms their fragility. The question then becomes not how ancient people did impossible things, but how often humanity has already solved the same problems, only to lose the solutions. Each collapse resets not just technology, but understanding. Each recovery starts from a partial archive. Seen this way, history resembles recursion rather than progression. Similar challenges arise. Similar solutions appear. Context changes. Tools change, but underlying constraints remain. Humanity learns, forgets, and learns again. What unsettles us is not that ancient societies were advanced, but that advancement does not guarantee continuity. Complexity is not durable. It requires constant reinforcement. When reinforcement fails, collapse is swift. The stones remain because they are indifferent to collapse. They do not transmit instructions. They only testify that someone once knew how to shape them with purpose. The silence surrounding them is not ignorance. It is the sound of knowledge that did not survive the conditions required to sustain it. Civilization is not defined by its peak, but by its weakest link. And history, when read carefully, is a record of those links breaking again and again, leaving behind achievements that outlasted the memory of how they were made. When knowledge fragments and techniques vanish, what remains is not chaos, but reinterpretation. Later societies inherit the physical remnants of earlier achievements and attempt to explain them using the intellectual tools available at the time. This process reshapes the past, not through deception, but through necessity. Meaning must be assigned, even when understanding is incomplete. This is how technology becomes myth. Across ancient cultures, structures that once served practical or integrative functions were gradually reclassified as sacred. Their original purposes faded, replaced by symbolic interpretations that fit new social realities. A structure aligned to track seasonal change becomes a temple for a solar deity. A water management system becomes a sacred spring. Precision engineering transforms into divine craftsmanship. This shift is not accidental. When a society inherits a structure it cannot reproduce, the safest explanation is reverence. Sacredness protects what understanding cannot. By embedding the unknown within ritual and taboo, cultures ensure preservation without comprehension. This mechanism explains why ancient monuments are often surrounded by elaborate mythologies that bear little resemblance to their likely original use. Myths do not preserve function. They preserve importance. They signal that something matters, even if no one remembers why. As generations pass, reinterpretation compounds. Each culture overlays its own cosmology onto inherited structures. Over time, the original builders vanish entirely from memory. Credit transfers to gods, demigods, giants, or legendary ancestors. Human agency recedes, replaced by the supernatural. This pattern appears globally. In some traditions, ancient builders are described as beings of great size or strength. In others, they are immortal sages or sky-born teachers. These descriptions do not necessarily indicate fantasy. They indicate distance. When a culture cannot imagine itself capable of such feats, it externalizes the capability. Archaeology often treats these stories as distractions, yet they reveal something essential: acknowledgement of inheritance. These cultures did not claim authorship. They recognized that what they lived among was older than themselves. The same process occurs with knowledge systems. Ancient mathematical and astronomical principles are preserved in symbolic form long after their practical application is forgotten. Numbers gain personalities, cycles become narratives, equations become rituals. The system survives, but its logic dissolves into metaphor. This transformation is particularly visible in cosmology. Early frameworks that linked celestial observation with agricultural timing, navigation, and architecture eventually become creation myths and moral allegories. The sky remains important, but its role shifts from predictive to prescriptive. Once writing emerges and spreads, these mythologized systems are frozen in text. The written word preserves content, but arrests evolution. What was once adaptable knowledge becomes doctrine. Correction becomes heresy. The system stabilizes culturally, but stagnates intellectually. Ironically, writing accelerates forgetting. Oral systems rely on constant repetition and adjustment. Written systems preserve errors alongside truths. When catastrophe strikes again, written records are lost, but the rigidity they imposed leaves little flexibility for recovery. This cycle of reinterpretation and loss produces historical compression. Multiple layers of civilization collapse into a single narrative. Events separated by millennia merge into one age. Builders from different eras are conflated. The past becomes flatter than it truly was. Modern historians attempt to unflatten this record using stratigraphy, dating techniques, and comparative analysis. These tools are powerful, but they operate within constraints. They can identify when stone was cut, but not why. They can measure alignment, but not intention. They can trace migration, but not memory. The result is a tension between material evidence and narrative coherence. When evidence does not fit established timelines, it is often categorized as anomaly rather than prompt. Anomalies are uncomfortable because they resist integration without revision. This resistance is not purely institutional, it is psychological. Accepting deep discontinuity undermines the comfort of progress. It suggests that human achievement is more fragile than we prefer to believe, that entire systems can vanish without legacy, that we are not guaranteed continuity. Yet reinterpretation itself is a form of resilience. Cultures that survive catastrophe do so by adapting meaning. They repurpose what they inherit. They build new identities atop old foundations. In doing so, they preserve fragments of earlier worlds, even as they misunderstand them. The danger arises when reinterpretation is mistaken for origin, when myths are read as invention rather than inheritance, when the first written account is treated as the first occurrence. This collapses deep time into shallow history. Recognizing reinterpretation as a survival strategy allows a different reading of ancient narratives. Myths of gods descending to teach humanity may encode the arrival of displaced knowledge holders. Stories of divine punishment may reflect environmental catastrophe. Legends of golden ages may preserve memory of lost stability. These narratives are not literal histories, but neither are they pure fiction. They are cultural fossils, shaped by trauma, transmission, and time. Like geological fossils, they distort original form, but confirm existence. What emerges is a picture of humanity not as a singular upward march, but as a species repeatedly forced to rebuild meaning from ruins. Each rebuild reinterprets the past according to present needs. Each reinterpretation adds another layer between us and what was. The past does not disappear. It transforms. It hides within symbols, stories, and stones that outlast their explanations. When we encounter these remnants, confusion is not failure. It is evidence of distance. Civilization, then, is not only about building. It is about explaining what we no longer know how to build. And history, when stripped of certainty, becomes an exercise in humility, reminding us that understanding is always provisional, and memory is always incomplete. What we inherit is not truth intact, but truth refracted through survival. And within that refraction lies the quiet suggestion that much has already been lost, not because it was insignificant, but because it was vulnerable. At some point, the focus shifts from what was lost to why it was forgotten. The erosion of memory is not only the result of catastrophe, but of selective survival. What endures is not necessarily what was most important, but what was easiest to preserve. This bias shapes every historical narrative we inherit. Writing, often celebrated as the triumph of civilization, plays a paradoxical role in this process. It preserves information, but it also narrows perspective. Written records privilege administration, religion, and power. They capture laws, lineages, and rituals. They rarely document methods that were considered common knowledge at the time. When those methods disappear, the record remains silent. This silence creates an illusion of simplicity. Later readers assume that if a technique was not written down, it did not exist. In reality, many ancient skills were transmitted through apprenticeship, observation, and repetition. They were lived, not archived. When the social structures that sustained them collapsed, the skills vanished with the people who embodied them. This dynamic explains why some of the most impressive ancient achievements appear unsupported by documentation. The absence of blueprints does not imply absence of planning. It implies that planning was not externalized. Knowledge resided in communities, not in texts. Over time, writing redefines authority. What is written becomes real. What is unwritten becomes suspect. Oral traditions, no matter how consistent, are dismissed as unreliable. This dismissal accelerates forgetting, especially after catastrophe, when written records are more likely to be lost than stories carried in memory. Yet even oral traditions degrade. Without reinforcement, details blur. Events compress. Time collapses. What remains is emotional truth rather than factual precision. Floods become singular. Migrations become divine journeys. Teachers become gods. Archaeology attempts to correct this distortion by reading material culture. But material culture carries its own biases. Stone survives, wood does not. Metal corrodes. Textiles decay. The archaeological record favors monumentality over everyday life. It captures outcomes, not processes. This bias is particularly dangerous when interpreting technological capability. Large structures survive. Tools do not. The ability to coordinate labor, manage resources, and plan long-term leaves little direct trace. What remains is the final product, stripped of context. This creates a recurring misinterpretation. Ancient societies are judged by their visible tools rather than their invisible systems. When the systems are gone, the achievements appear inexplicable. The gap is filled with either skepticism or fantasy, neither of which addresses the underlying loss. Another force accelerates forgetting. Success. When a society stabilizes after collapse, it reorients toward immediate challenges. Rebuilding food systems, establishing order, and securing territory take precedence over preserving abstract knowledge. Memory becomes a luxury. As generations pass, the urgency fades. New identities form. The past becomes distant. What was once a warning becomes a story. What was once practical becomes symbolic. The knowledge that survived catastrophe begins to erode under normalcy. Environmental stability plays a crucial role here. During long, stable periods, innovation accelerates, but awareness of vulnerability declines. Societies invest in growth rather than resilience. Redundancy is reduced. Systems become efficient but brittle. This brittleness sets the stage for future collapse. When disruption returns, the same pattern repeats. Knowledge fragments. Survivors carry what they can. Reinterpretation begins again. Seen over deep time, human history resembles a series of overlapping waves. Each wave carries fragments of the last, reshaped by new conditions. None begin from zero. None preserve everything. This perspective challenges the notion of progress as accumulation. Progress is conditional. It depends on continuity. Without it, advancement resets, regardless of past achievement. A civilization can solve complex problems, then lose the ability to even recognize those solutions. The persistence of ancient anomalies makes sense in this context. They are not evidence of impossibility. They are evidence of discontinuity. The gap between capability and record reflects loss, not illusion. Modern society often assumes it will be remembered. Our infrastructure feels permanent. Our data feels secure. But permanence is an illusion born of scale. Given enough time and disruption, even digital records will vanish. Storage mediums decay. Power grids fail. Formats become unreadable. Future archaeologists, if any exist, may find fragments of our world and struggle to explain them. They will infer capability from residue, not documentation. They will debate what was possible and what was imagined. They will face the same silence. This realization reframes ancient history. Instead of asking why earlier societies lacked certain tools, we might ask why we assume they lacked understanding. Instead of demanding proof in forms that rarely survive, we might examine patterns that do. Memory is not a passive archive. It is an active process shaped by survival, power, and chance. What we know about the past is not what happened. It is what remained. Recognizing this does not license speculation without restraint. It demands humility. It asks us to accept that certainty decreases as we move backward, not because people were less capable, but because time is ruthless. The deeper lesson is not about lost civilizations. It is about the fragility of continuity. Knowledge is not self-preserving. It requires care, redundancy, and stability. Remove those, and even the most sophisticated systems unravel. History, then, is not a straight line of improvement. It is a record of endurance against erasure. And what survives tells us less about what mattered most, and more about what managed, against odds, to last. When viewed from a distance, the repeated loss of knowledge appears tragic. Up close, it reveals something more unsettling. Forgetting is not accidental. It is structural. Human societies are not designed to preserve deep continuity. They are designed to survive the present. Every generation inherits a world shaped by choices it did not make. When stability returns after collapse, attention shifts forward. Reconstruction favors immediacy. Systems that cannot justify themselves in the present are abandoned, even if they were essential in the past. This is how long-term knowledge dies quietly, without violence or intent. Consider how complex systems depend on context. Techniques for large-scale construction, environmental management, or astronomical calibration require shared assumptions, consistent training, and long horizons. Remove any one of these, and the system fails. After catastrophe, horizons shrink. Survival compresses time. In such conditions, specialization becomes a liability. A society cannot afford knowledge that serves no immediate function. Skills that once maintained infrastructure or tracked long celestial cycles are deprioritized. What remains are versatile abilities: food production, shelter building, defense. Everything else becomes optional. This narrowing is visible archaeologically. After major disruptions, material culture simplifies. Tools become multifunctional. Architecture becomes modular. Ornamentation declines. This is not regression in intelligence. It is triage. The loss accelerates when population density drops. Knowledge thrives in networks. When networks fragment, transmission falters. Elders die without apprentices. Masters lose students. What cannot be passed on in a single lifetime disappears. This explains why certain ancient practices appear abruptly and vanish just as suddenly. They depended on fragile chains of instruction. Once broken, reconstruction becomes impossible without rediscovery. Rediscovery, however, rarely recreates original form. It adapts. New solutions emerge under new constraints. Over time, these solutions are mistaken for first inventions. Memory of prior attempts is gone. This cycle repeats across domains. Agriculture emerges, collapses, and re-emerges in modified forms. Urban planning appears, vanishes, then returns differently. Even metallurgy shows regional restarts, each with its own learning curve. From a modern perspective, these restarts look like progress. From a deeper perspective, they look like echoes. The environment plays an active role in shaping what survives. Regions spared the worst disruptions preserve more continuity. Regions repeatedly affected by floods, droughts, or seismic activity experience sharper resets. This unevenness explains why history appears to begin earlier in some places than others. Coastal societies, despite their advantages, are especially vulnerable. Access to trade and resources comes at the cost of exposure. Rising seas erase more than land. They erase memory anchored to place. Inland societies inherit survivors, but lose context. As these survivors integrate, their knowledge becomes diluted. Techniques adapted to coastal environments may not translate inland. Astronomical references tied to horizon markers disappear. Navigation knowledge loses relevance. What cannot be used is forgotten. Over generations, the descendants of survivors no longer recognize the origin of inherited practices. They become tradition, then custom, then myth. The past recedes into abstraction. This abstraction is reinforced by power structures. New elites legitimize themselves by controlling narrative. They frame the present as a beginning. A golden age is placed behind them, safely unreachable. Authority rests on renewal, not remembrance. Writing, when it emerges, serves this authority. It records lineage, law, and conquest. It rarely records loss. Collapse does not flatter power. It threatens legitimacy. Silence becomes convenient. This is not conspiracy. It is incentive. Societies tell stories that stabilize identity. Deep discontinuity destabilizes it. Acknowledging repeated collapse undermines confidence in permanence. As a result, cultural memory smooths over rupture. History becomes a sequence of rises rather than a pattern of resets. Catastrophe is minimized. Survival is celebrated. Yet the physical world refuses to cooperate with this narrative. Geological scars remain. Submerged landscapes persist. Anomalous structures endure. These remnants contradict the idea of clean beginnings. When modern inquiry encounters these contradictions, it faces a choice: integrate them by expanding the narrative or isolate them as exceptions. The latter is easier. Exceptions do not demand revision. But exceptions accumulate. When they do, they cease to be exceptional. They become evidence of structure. This structure suggests that human history operates within cycles imposed by planetary forces. Climate shifts, sea level rise, and tectonic activity are not background conditions. They are drivers. They shape where and how civilization can persist. Under this view, the question is no longer whether advanced knowledge existed earlier, but how often it was lost. The archaeological record becomes not a measure of first invention, but of last survival. This reframing alters how we interpret ancient achievement. Precision becomes less mysterious. Sudden emergence becomes more plausible. The absence of documentation becomes expected. It also alters how we view our own moment. Modern society is uniquely global, interconnected, and dependent on fragile systems. Its knowledge is vast but centralized. Its memory is stored in formats that require constant energy to maintain. In this light, the past stops being exotic. It becomes familiar. The same forces that erased earlier systems still operate. Stability remains temporary. Continuity remains conditional. The uncomfortable implication is that forgetting is not failure. It is default. Preservation requires deliberate effort across generations. Without it, complexity collapses naturally. History, then, is not a monument to progress. It is a record of resistance against erasure, punctuated by losses too deep to fully recover. What survives does not define what was possible. It defines what endured. And endurance, over deep time, is a narrow filter through which most human experience never passes. When modern researchers confront the possibility of deep discontinuity in human history, the resistance they encounter is not purely evidential. It is conceptual. The prevailing framework of history assumes accumulation, where each generation builds upon the last. Discontinuity threatens this assumption. It implies that knowledge can peak, vanish, and be forgotten so thoroughly that later societies mistake rediscovery for invention. Science itself is not opposed to this idea. In fact, several disciplines already accept versions of it. Evolution proceeds through extinction and radiation. Geology advances through catastrophe and renewal. Ecology resets after collapse. Human systems, however, are often treated as exempt, as though culture floats above natural forces rather than being embedded within them. This exemption is psychological. Humans prefer narratives of ascent. Collapse feels like failure. Forgetting feels like regression. Yet from a systems perspective, collapse is not an anomaly. It is a phase. Complex systems grow until they exceed resilience, then reorganize at lower complexity. Archaeology quietly supports this model. Many ancient sites show signs of abrupt abandonment rather than gradual decline. Tools are left unfinished. Structures are left incomplete. Settlements are vacated rapidly. These patterns do not align with slow cultural evolution. They align with disruption. The difficulty lies in scale. Archaeology operates at human timescales. Geology operates at planetary ones. When the two intersect, interpretation becomes unstable. A flood that lasts weeks can erase a culture that took centuries to build. In the geological record, this appears as an instant. In human memory, it becomes an apocalypse. This mismatch distorts reconstruction. When archaeologists date a structure, they date its last use, not its origin. Earlier phases may be invisible or misattributed. Layers are compressed. Gaps appear where continuity once existed. Dating techniques themselves are not infallible. They rely on assumptions of undisturbed context. Flooding, seismic activity, and human reuse complicate stratigraphy. Materials can be displaced, reused, or contaminated. Precision decreases with age. None of this invalidates archaeology. It contextualizes it. Evidence is partial not because researchers are careless, but because the archive is damaged. This damage explains why certain questions remain unresolved despite decades of study. How were massive stones moved consistently without clear infrastructure? How were precise alignments achieved across generations without written calculation? How did complex urban planning appear so early in some regions? These questions persist because the answers may lie in missing phases. If techniques were refined over long periods that are now erased, their sudden appearance is an illusion. What looks like invention may be inheritance without documentation. Modern reluctance to entertain this possibility often stems from fear of speculation. History has been abused by unfounded claims, and skepticism is warranted. But skepticism becomes dogma when it dismisses patterns without engagement. A mature approach distinguishes between evidence of existence and evidence of continuity. We do not need proof of a single lost global civilization to acknowledge that earlier systems of knowledge may have existed and vanished. The scale can be regional, the duration brief, and the impact profound. The insistence on either total acceptance or total rejection creates false binaries. History is rarely that clean. It operates in gradients, partial systems, fragmented transmission. This gradient perspective aligns with how human cognition works. Knowledge is distributed, not centralized. Lose enough nodes, and the system collapses even if individuals remain intelligent. This is not a metaphor. It is how learning networks function. Ancient societies were networks. When those networks fractured, intelligence did not vanish. Coordination did. The difference matters. Coordination enables specialization. Specialization enables complexity. Remove coordination, and complexity collapses rapidly, regardless of individual capability. This is why advanced practices can disappear within a generation. Once lost, rediscovery follows a different path. New systems emerge under new constraints. They may reach similar outcomes through different routes. When they do, modern observers mistake convergence for originality. This misunderstanding reinforces the myth of linear progress. Each rediscovery is framed as a first step rather than a return. Recognizing cycles does not diminish modern achievement. It situates it. Our technologies are extraordinary, but they are also fragile. They depend on global coordination, uninterrupted energy, and continuous knowledge transmission. Remove anyone, and complexity unravels. The past offers not cautionary tales, but structural lessons. Collapse does not require moral failure. It requires misalignment between system scale and environmental resilience. When alignment fails, forgetting follows naturally. This realization reframes ancient anomalies. They are not embarrassments to be explained away. They are data points indicating that history is not smooth. Stone monuments, astronomical systems, and mythic memories form a triangulation. Each alone is ambiguous. Together they suggest depth beyond recorded beginnings. The challenge is not to replace one grand narrative with another, but to allow uncertainty where certainty has been overstated. To accept that some chapters of human experience are missing, not because they were insignificant, but because they were vulnerable. History, then, becomes less a timeline and more a terrain, shaped by erosion as much as construction. Peaks are visible, valleys are obscured. Some paths are lost entirely. What survives into the present is not a complete inheritance, but a filtered one. It reflects what endured disruption, not what defined an age. In accepting this, the question shifts. Instead of asking whether ancient people were capable of what we see, we ask how often capability has already been proven and forgotten. The past does not challenge modern intelligence. It challenges modern memory. And in that challenge lies a quieter truth. Humanity has always been capable of more than it remembers. When the fragments of ancient knowledge are placed side by side, a deeper implication begins to surface. The question is no longer whether humanity experienced periods of loss, but whether loss itself shaped the very psychology of civilization. Memory of collapse does not disappear. It mutates. It embeds itself into how societies think, govern, and plan for the future. One of the most persistent outcomes of repeated disruption is the obsession with order. Ancient legal systems, cosmologies, and moral codes often emphasize balance, restraint, and cyclical renewal. Excess is portrayed as dangerous. Hubris invites destruction. These themes are not philosophical abstractions. They are survival lessons encoded into culture. In societies that remember collapse, stability becomes sacred. Laws are rigid. Traditions are preserved with precision. Change is treated with suspicion. From a modern viewpoint, this rigidity can appear irrational or authoritarian. In context, it is protective. When the cost of error is extinction, experimentation feels reckless. This mindset is visible in early governance structures. Authority is often centralized. Knowledge is guarded. Ritual reinforces hierarchy. These are not merely tools of control. They are mechanisms for preserving continuity in a world believed to be fragile. Over time, as catastrophe recedes into myth, the protective function of these systems fades, but their structure remains. Authority persists without its original justification. Ritual continues without context. What was once adaptive becomes dogmatic. This transition explains the tension between innovation and tradition that runs through ancient history. New ideas are often framed as dangerous, heretical, or destabilizing. Innovation threatens memory, and memory is equated with survival. Yet, innovation never stops entirely. It emerges cautiously, often framed as rediscovery rather than invention. New practices are legitimized by linking them to ancient authority. Progress is disguised as return. This pattern appears in architecture, religion, and science. Reforms claim to restore lost purity. Technologies are justified as ancient wisdom recovered. Even political revolutions appeal to foundational principles rather than novelty. The psychological imprint of collapse shapes not only institutions, but identity. Societies define themselves in relation to a lost past. Golden ages loom behind them. Decline is always possible. Renewal is always necessary. This worldview fosters resilience, but limits imagination. When the past is perceived as superior, the future becomes a restoration project rather than an open field. Creativity is constrained by reverence. Archaeological evidence suggests that this reverence often centers on ancient sites whose origins are no longer understood. These sites become anchors of legitimacy. Power gravitates toward them. Control of sacred spaces translates into control of narrative. In this way, loss indirectly structures inequality. Those who claim guardianship of ancient knowledge gain authority, whether or not they understand that knowledge becomes secondary. Belief in continuity is enough. As societies expand and encounter one another, these inherited frameworks collide. Different memories of loss compete. Different versions of order clash. Conflict arises not only over resources, but over whose past is authoritative. This competition accelerates reinterpretation. Histories are rewritten. Origins are reframed. Collapse is externalized onto enemies or moral failure. The structural role of environmental disruption fades from view. Written history amplifies this distortion. It records victory, lineage, and continuity. It rarely records vulnerability. When collapse is acknowledged, it is moralized. Environmental causation is minimized. The result is a historical record that underrepresents disruption. Catastrophe becomes exception rather than norm. Resets are smoothed into transitions. Forgetting becomes invisible. Modern society inherits this bias. We see ourselves as unprecedented, not because we are uniquely advanced, but because our memory of loss is distant. Stability feels normal. Continuity feels guaranteed. Yet the underlying conditions have not changed. Climate shifts continue. Geological forces persist. Complexity remains fragile. The same dynamics that erased earlier systems still operate. This realization reframes ancient cautionary myths. They are not warnings against moral failure alone. They are records of systemic vulnerability. They remind us that complexity invites risk and that resilience requires humility. In this light, ancient emphasis on balance appears less mystical and more pragmatic. Sustainability is not a modern invention. It is an ancient response to lived instability. What distinguishes modern civilization is not intelligence, but scale. Our systems are global. Our interdependence is total. This amplifies both capability and vulnerability. The deeper lesson of ancient loss is not nostalgia, it is perspective. Human history is not a march away from fragility, it is a negotiation with it. Every society builds atop what remains. Every generation inherits both knowledge and blind spots. The blind spots are dangerous precisely because they are inherited unconsciously. Recognizing the structural nature of forgetting allows a different engagement with the past. Instead of asking who built what and when, we ask why certain patterns persist and others vanish. This shift does not undermine science or history, it strengthens them. It integrates human systems into the same framework we use to understand natural ones. Civilizations rise, specialize, and optimize. Then they overextend. Disruption occurs, survivors adapt, memory compresses. The cycle begins again. The stones that remain are not monuments to greatness. They are markers of interruption. They signal where continuity broke. Understanding them requires more than measurement. It requires acknowledging that human achievement is always provisional. The past is not distant because it is primitive. It is distant because it was interrupted. And in that interruption lies the most important inheritance of all, the reminder that survival, not progress, is the fundamental condition of history. As the fragments of deep history converge, the final realization is not about what ancient civilizations achieved, but about what humanity repeatedly misunderstands about itself. The past does not warn us through prophecy or myth alone. It warns us through pattern. And patterns, once recognized, are difficult to ignore. Across every era examined, the same cycle asserts itself. Complexity rises in periods of environmental stability. Knowledge becomes specialized, interconnected, and efficient. Systems grow powerful but dependent. When disruption arrives, it doesn't need to destroy everything. It only needs to sever continuity. Once that happens, collapse follows with startling speed. What is lost is not intelligence, it is coordination. Individuals survive, communities persist. But the frameworks that bind knowledge together fracture. Without those frameworks, advanced capability becomes unreachable, even if raw potential remains. This distinction matters because it reframes how we interpret both ancient collapse and modern confidence. Intelligence is not enough. Innovation is not enough. Without durable systems of transmission, complexity is temporary. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. Their emphasis on balance, redundancy, and cyclical renewal was not philosophical abstraction. It was risk management. They built calendars into stone because memory alone was insufficient. They embedded knowledge into ritual because writing could be lost. They sanctified continuity because forgetting meant extinction. Over time, as catastrophe faded from living memory, these protective measures hardened into tradition. Their original function was obscured, but their structure endured. When later societies dismissed them as superstition, they unknowingly dismantled safeguards built for survival. Modern civilization, in contrast, externalizes memory. Knowledge is stored in machines, networks, and centralized institutions. This creates extraordinary capability, but it also concentrates vulnerability. When systems fail, recovery is not guaranteed. Restarting complexity requires more than intelligence. It requires access to memory in usable form. The archaeological record shows us what happens when that access is lost. Achievements outlast understanding. Monuments persist without explanation. Precision remains without context. Later generations stand among ruins, convinced they are seeing beginnings rather than remnants. This misinterpretation is not failure. It is consequence. The past does not leave instructions for its own interpretation. It leaves traces shaped by chance. What unsettles modern observers is not the idea that ancient people were capable. It is the implication that capability does not ensure permanence. That civilization can reach extraordinary heights and still vanish almost without echo. Seen this way, debates about lost civilizations miss the deeper point. The question is not whether there was a single advanced global culture, but how often humanity has already solved fundamental problems and then lost the solutions. History becomes less about origin stories and more about resilience thresholds. How much disruption can a system absorb before memory collapses? How redundancy is maintained? How knowledge is distributed? Ancient anomalies matter because they mark previous thresholds. They show where systems once exceeded resilience. They are not mysteries to be sensationalized. They are data points in a long experiment humanity keeps repeating. This experiment continues today. Climate shifts accelerate. Global systems strain. Knowledge becomes more specialized and less accessible. The conditions that preceded earlier collapses are not unique. They are recurring. The difference is scale. Modern civilization operates faster, wider, and more tightly coupled than any before it. This amplifies both strength and fragility. A failure in one region can cascade globally. Recovery requires coordination on a scale never previously tested. Ancient history offers no comfort here, but it offers clarity. Collapse does not require moral decay or external invasion. It requires misalignment between complexity and resilience. When systems grow brittle, even small shocks can trigger disproportionate loss. The lesson embedded in stone and silence is not that humanity is doomed, but that continuity must be actively defended. Memory must be redundant. Knowledge must be distributed. Stability must not be mistaken for permanence. What survived from earlier worlds did so not because it was superior, but because it was durable. Stone outlasted context. Myth outlasted instruction. Pattern outlasted explanation. Our task, if there is one, is not to romanticize the past or fear repetition, but to recognize the structural forces at work. To understand that history is shaped as much by what disappears as by what remains. The past we inherit is incomplete by definition. That incompleteness is not a flaw in research. It is the natural outcome of time acting on fragile systems. When we look at ancient anomalies, we are not seeing evidence of impossibility. We are seeing evidence of interruption, of systems that worked well enough to matter, but not well enough to survive disruption intact. In this light, the story of civilization is not a straight ascent from ignorance to knowledge. It is a series of climbs interrupted by falls, each leaving fewer traces than the last. What endures is not certainty, but pattern. And the pattern is clear enough to read. Civilization is not rare. Continuity is. And history, when stripped of comfort, does not tell us how far we have come. It tells us how easily we forget where we have already been. In the end, the question that remains is not whether a lost civilization once ruled the ancient world, nor whether humanity's past contains chapters more complex than our timelines allow. The deeper question is quieter and far more unsettling. What does it mean to live on a planet that forgets? Earth is not a museum. It does not preserve by intent. It preserves by accident. Wind erases, water dissolves, tectonic plates recycle memory into magma. Time is not neutral. It is selective. What survives is not what mattered most, but what resisted erasure long enough to be noticed. Human history unfolds inside this indifference. Civilizations rise believing themselves permanent, only to discover that permanence is conditional. Knowledge feels cumulative while continuity holds. When continuity breaks, accumulation collapses into fragments. The illusion of uniqueness that defines modern society is born from this filtering process. We see ourselves as unprecedented, not because no one came before us, but because we stand on what remains, not on what was lost. The deeper the loss, the more convincing the illusion. Ancient structures unsettle us because they challenge that illusion. They do not scream superiority. They whisper continuity. They imply that intelligence, organization, and foresight existed under conditions we no longer recognize. They hint that progress is not owned by any one era. The absence of direct evidence is often mistaken for reassurance. If nothing survived, nothing significant must have existed. Yet geology teaches the opposite lesson. The more violent the disruption, the less it leaves behind. The cleanest erasures belong to the most abrupt endings. When the last ice age ended, it did not negotiate. Coastlines drowned, rivers rerouted, landscapes were redrawn. Human systems embedded in those landscapes disappeared with them. Not slowly, not ceremonially, but decisively. What survived was inland. What survived was adaptable. What survived was portable. Memory shed complexity to preserve meaning. Knowledge became story. Systems became symbols. The past compressed. This compression defines how we inherit history. We receive the simplified version because the complex one could not travel through catastrophe intact. What reaches us is what could fit inside a collapsing world. Understanding this reframes ancient mystery. The question is no longer why we cannot find more evidence, but why we expect to. Our expectations are shaped by a rare period of stability, not by the norm of deep time. The norm is disruption. The norm is forgetting. Seen through this lens, the past stops demanding answers it cannot give and starts offering a warning it does not need to articulate. Complexity is fragile. Knowledge is mortal. Continuity is earned, not guaranteed. The civilizations that came before us are not lost because they failed. They are lost because failure is part of the system. They rose, adapted, and were overtaken by forces larger than culture, larger than intention. What remains of them is not instruction, but perspective. They remind us that intelligence does not accumulate automatically. It must be carried deliberately across generations. When that carrying stops, intelligence fragments into capability without coordination. They remind us that progress without resilience accelerates collapse, that efficiency without redundancy invites erasure, that memory outsourced entirely to systems will vanish when systems fail. Most importantly, they remind us that history does not end. It resets. We are not standing at the pinnacle of a single ascent. We are standing on a plateau formed by countless rises and falls beneath us. Some left visible stone, others left only distorted echoes. The future will treat us no differently. What survives of our world will not represent us fairly. It will represent what endured disruption. Future observers will argue about what we were capable of. They will misinterpret our remnants. They will debate our intelligence based on incomplete traces. And in that debate, they will repeat the same mistake we make now, confusing survival with significance. The lesson of deep history is not despair. It is responsibility. Knowing that forgetting is structural places the burden of continuity on choice, not destiny. Preservation is not automatic. It is an act. Whether humanity breaks this cycle or repeats it remains unanswered. But the past makes one thing clear. The question is not whether collapse can happen again. The question is whether this time anything essential will make it through. Because history does not ask permission before it erases. It only leaves behind enough to remind whoever comes next that someone once stood here, certain they would be remembered.